Hello, everyone, and welcome back. I'm so excited to be joined today by two of my favorite researchers in the industry. We've got doctors James Steele and Dr. Patroklis Androulakis Korakakis. Hope I got that right. Uh, Close enough, James says. Dr. PAK, we'll call him instead, so I don't have to keep screwing that up throughout the episode. Guys, why don't you both say hello? Give us a quick rundown on what you've been up to since we had you on last.
James.
No, I was going to say, age before beauty. Dr. James Steele, Associate Professor in Sport and Exercise Science at Solent University. And God, you want a quick rundown of what I've been up to since we last spoke? Man, a hell of a lot.
Give us like a 30-second version.
Lots of big data stuff again. So lots of interesting kind of big data analysis coming out. I won't say too much more about that. Lots of different fun, complicated statistical stuff.
What about you, PAK?
So we've been finishing up the study, an interview and survey study on deloads for strength and physique athletes. So that includes powerlifters, strongmen, the strong women, Olympic weightlifting athletes, as well as bodybuilders of all categories, including physique and bikini. So we are in the process of writing up the manuscript for that at the moment. At the same time, my good friend and colleague and also student of James Milo is working on his systematic review and meta-analysis for his PhD on range of motion, strength, hypertrophy, a bunch of different sub-analyses that they've included. They've done some really cool stuff. So that's also in the works. And me personally, I am near full-time online coaching for Stronger by Science, and at the same time working on a strength and hypertrophy training app that will essentially coach people through strength and hypertrophy related outcomes. So we have been working with Milo again on that in the background, building the logic of the app, as well as a ton of behind the scenes that an app requires. So that's been me.
Yeah, love it. A little longer than 30 seconds, but we'll allow it. So just to give everyone an idea of why we have Dr. Steele and Dr. PAK on today, there was a paper recently published, I believe it was in April of this year, finally, James, on what we're calling the FIT20 paper. So it's a minimum effective dose approach to strength training. And Dr. Steele is the king of data, as we know, and PAK is the king of minimum dose strength training. So we thought we'd bring the two of them together, the prince, to talk about this paper, which I think has a lot of really cool implications to our industry, as well as just strength training in general. What are the long-term implications of a minimum dose approach to fitness training, to resistance training in general? So maybe Dr. Steele, you can start us off here with what is FIT20? What was sort of the impetus of this paper, and why should our listeners care about this research paper?
Yeah, sure. So FIT20 have been around for some time now. I believe they first kind of got established in the mid-2000s and then broke out. I'm going to get some of the dates wrong, but they're a franchise organization, similar to, I guess the S now run franchises, which is great. So they operate in a similar sort of manner to the S. They use a kind of lower volume, higher intensity of effort approach, but all of their facilities are very standardized. They're kind of carbon copies of each other, each franchises, and they essentially use a traditional kind of Nautilus / super slow protocol. It's a once a week visit for each client, and they do around 6 exercises, full body workouts. They use a super slow cadence, and they essentially do a single set to failure on each exercise. And so I got involved with FIT20 probably 5-6 years ago now. I spoke at a couple of events that they were running, and got to know the guys who work there, so Rob and Walter and Bram really well, and Sophie, and became good, friends with them. And also we saw a lot of opportunities to be able to utilize some of the data that they were capturing for research. So unique to FIT20, at least at that point in my experience, was that they were incorporating across all of their facilities cloud-based technology, and every trainer had an app, so there was no pens and paper or anything like that. And every workout was recorded there and then into the app and then uploaded straight to their cloud database. So I got speaking with some of the database managers, and we got talking about what data was in there and whether it'd be possible to access some of that data, because it was a really unique opportunity to look at what are the long-term effects of minimal dose resistance training upon strength gains, because there's a real gap in the literature with respect to minimal dose training in the first place, with hence PAK's kind of PhD focus, but also we have a real gap in the literature in terms of longitudinal strength studies. When we first looked into the literature to see what are the kind of longest intervention-based studies where we know that participants have actually followed a training program for a certain period of time, at most you see studies up to about 2 years in length. And then any of the studies that are slightly longer and have observed kind of trainees over a longer period of time have typically got very, very small sample sizes. Whereas contrastingly, we had access to almost 15,000 Fit 20 clients data in this data set. So it's a real cool, unique opportunity to do some interesting research with it.
Yeah, and before we dive more into the specifics of this study and PAK, I also wanted you to come on at some point to talk about your role in this study, how you came on sort of with your PhD and how it sort of fit together. But just to kind of reiterate what Dr. Steele was saying there, Fit 20 is a really interesting concept. They only do once a week strength training, right? So 20 minutes with their clients in a controlled environment, and it's only 4 to 6 exercises. So they're really focusing, for the most part, on big multi-joint movements. So like a big push, like a chest press, a pull, like a pull down, a leg press, and then some other complementary movements like a midsection exercise, a crunch. I believe they do low back. And then like an ad and abduction. So very, very minimalistic and using the exact same protocol every time. So an extremely interesting data set, because as we know at Discover Strength, we throw a variety of protocols at people. We do a bunch of different things. And as we know in science, the more you can control the different variables, the better off you're going to be understanding the outcomes over the long term. So I really just want to cue that up of why Dr. Steele, Dr. Fisher, Dr. PAK were so interested in this data set, because so many variables are controlled, so many things are controlled that just don't always get done in some other research studies. And I don't think, and correct me if I'm wrong here, James, they weren't actually collecting this data for the purposes of research initially. You just kind of saw it as an opportunity.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is a big trend actually with a number of current projects that I'm working on. Is a lot of organizations, institutions now capture data. I think everyone feels like they should be capturing data. Like that's, we live in a data-driven world now. Everyone feels like they should be capturing data, but people don't necessarily have the skills or the expertise to be able to recognize the value that data represents, how you could actually go about interrogating that data and pulling out insights from that data as well. So yeah, like this is just it's almost and a lot of organizations will capture data for that one-to-one interaction with the client. So they're capturing the data so that every time a client comes in, they can look at what that client's previous workout was. They can visualize trends and things like that for that person. But the benefit we saw was that all of that individual data, although that's the reason they were using it, it's going into a database that we can pull it all down and look at in an easy way.
Yeah, so PAK, before we dive in here, I'd love for you to jump in. And now our listeners will know that your PhD, which obviously now he's Dr. PAK, so he did defend his thesis appropriately. But your focus has been on minimum dose with powerlifters. How did you sort of come in to be a part of this study, and what was sort of your role in it? What were you doing with the minimum dose here?
So the thing that was particularly, let me just turn off the fan. Go. The thing that I found particularly interesting with this data set, because as you said, my background was in strength athletes, and we did minimum dose training interventions, as well as some interview studies, and we explored that topic in that population. I found that particular data set extremely interesting because of one, it wasn't in strength athletes. Strength athletes are great, and it's a great niche that I find very interesting, and I'm doing most of my research around strength sports and or physique sports. But at the same time, this was in recreationally active individuals, and that specific population was also a population that was, individuals who had a very busy lifestyle and wanted to have a very time-efficient approach to training. And the most interesting thing about this data set was the nature of their training and how minimum, like it wasn't just minimum dose, it was the minimumest of doses, if I can make that up, or if I can make up that word, just to say that. Because, and the fact that we had data for such a long period of time, so 6+ years, and for so many thousands of participants, doing just a few sets per week for just 20 minutes, that was fascinating. Because as noted on the paper as well, there's been previous studies that have looked at strength changes over time in strength athletes, in powerlifters, and in weightlifters, and have found sort of a similar trend of their strength increasing for some time and then sort of plateauing, even though they've continued training. But to look at just recreationally active people doing only 20 minutes of resistance training per week, I think that was fascinating, and the practical applications and implications that this paper has for people that are listening, or coaches or trainers that are working with individuals that are not bodybuilders or powerlifters or athletes. I think the implications are massive. So that was what I found very interesting. Obviously, James has had this data set for years now, and it's something that he had mentioned and was working on for a while. So I still remember being in his office and him going over the fact that, hey, in sports science, having access to a data set of 100 people is considered extreme, especially for a training intervention study, let alone 15,000 people. So the nature of the data, the training intervention, and the amount of training that these people followed was extremely interesting and unique and rare.
Yeah. So before we get into some of the findings, and you've touched on them a little bit, both of you guys, I think it's really important to drive this point home. And you touched on it a little bit there, PAK, as well. But time is obviously the number one listed restriction to exercise for most people, especially recreationally active people. They just don't think they have enough time. So looking at a data set where people are only working out once a week for 20 minutes doing some sort of full body routine, if we can see some sort of progress, some sort of growth in this data set, that's going to have lots of applications to real world validity, right? And we always talk about ecological validity in research studies. This is probably potentially one of the most ecologically valid studies I've ever seen, just from a data perspective, because it's all just normal people. None of these people, as far as I know, maybe there was a few of them, were college male students, right? They're not, or super elderly people that we may be investigating in a lot of other research studies. These are just normal people. And almost, like you said, 15,000 of them, 14,600 something participants. And then we look at the length of this study, right? 6+ years. Again, I just want to drive these points home for people. As James was saying, a long study is going to be about 2 years. Most resistance training studies are in the ballpark of, correct me if I'm wrong here, guys, but about 8 to maybe 14 weeks is a pretty good study for a lot of resistance training. And then just for our listeners who know, or were maybe even a part of our recent Discover Strength paper, where we had that crossover design, high loads, low loads, with people that I think both James and PAK were involved with as well. That was 100 participants, and that was one of the biggest studies that's ever been done, like super interesting study with just over 100 people. This is, again, 14,000 people, right? So a lot of validity in this study, a lot of things that are super interesting. Am I missing anything else there, guys, is why this paper and this data set could potentially be so important for long-term strength adaptations?
I mean, one of the other interesting things we did as well is, we make a big deal of the size of the data set as well, but it's also not the only data set in the paper that we actually interrogate as well. So, I mean, one of the questions we had was, given kind of what you've explained there, Logan, the idea that this is very ecologically valid data, but at the same time, it's still it may only be particularly applicable to people who fit that demographic population performing Fit 20 style interventions. So one of the things we wanted to be able to do as well was, because we noticed some interesting things about the way in which strength changed over time with continued training, we also looked at some other data sets as well using completely different training approaches. So, for example, we took a random sample of 10,000 powerlifters from the Open Powerlifting database. And we also were able to get hold of a cross-sectional survey of resistance training people, people who were involved in recreational resistance training from a Reddit forum. We had about 2,000 respondents from that, to just see, like, are we seeing similar kinds of forms of growth in terms of strength changes over time with differing training approaches, differing populations, and things like that. And does the shape of strength change over time differ, or is it just the magnitude that differs?
Yeah, super important points there. Go ahead, PAK. It looks like you had something to add as well.
Well, it was pretty much that this paper is not just a hey, look, you can get away with a single set performed once a week per exercise sort of paper, but also a commentary on just a glimpse on how one's strength adapts over the years, which I think is very interesting. But yeah, James covered that for me.
Yeah, so why don't you talk to us a little, PAK, about what the paper actually looked at then? So I know there were 3 main lifts that were targeted. And if James needs to hop in from the data perspective at some point, he can as well. But what were the 3 lifts, and then how are they sort of progressing over time? And then what did that progression look like? And we can talk about the Fit20 data set specifically, and then maybe how that compared and contrasted with that powerlifting set data set, or the Reddit data set that you guys mentioned as well.
I think, given the fact that James did the analysis, I think it makes more sense for him to lead on that and for me to jump in and add a few comments, just so that he doesn't jump in and add it on, especially with how the data compares.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah,
sure. And so I guess I'll try and give, without getting too detailed, because the statistical analysis is it's fairly advanced. So I mean, most sport and exercise scientists will probably read the paper and have to read it a few times to get to grips with what analysis has been done. But for all intents and purposes, what we did is we fit an appropriate set of statistical models to explore how strength changed over time in these individuals. And we use an approach called mixed effects modeling, which lets us essentially take each person and kind of fit like a growth curve to each person, so that we can then kind of aggregate that, see what the overall effect is. We can see how much variation there is in terms of baseline strength levels and how that changes over time. And what we did initially was we fit a series of different models to see which kind of model was a good fit to the data, but also was quite what we call parsimonious. So it was a simple model in terms of understanding what it's telling us. And essentially what we found was a really good model to fit the data was something that we call a linear log model. So essentially all that means is that strength change is logarithmic with time. So as you continue training, the changes in strength that you produce on a week-by-week basis, or any kind of period of time, they get smaller and smaller over time. So what it looks like is, if you visualize time on the kind of raw scale, week to week to week, you get rapid changes over the initial stages of resistance training that slowly start to become less and less and less, and start to kind of plateau out somewhat over time. Now, there's obviously going to be variation across individuals, but on average, we fit used a couple of different kinds of models to try and maybe detect where it looked like plateaus were beginning to happen, and they happen anywhere from sort of 6 months up to 2 years or so. So again, like, there's a lot of variation in it, but the majority of people are getting the majority of their strength gains over a reasonably short period of time, in terms of kind of a whole training career. And after that, strength gains are becoming smaller and smaller. And I guess one of the interesting conclusions from this as well is those strength gains can be maintained even with a very minimal dose. And what we also saw was that the shape of strength change over time was very similar in the powerlifting data, very similar in the Reddit weight room data. It was just that the magnitudes differed. So, for example, in the powerlifting data, we still saw that kind of logarithmic growth, but the absolute changes in strength or the standardized changes in strength were a lot smaller. So, to kind of put it in perspective, we had after the sort of like 6-7 year period that we had data for from the Fit 20 participants, we saw around about kind of 30 to 50% strength gains from baseline, and or 50 to 60%. Sorry, it was about 30 to 50% over the first 1 to 2 years. But when we look at the powerlifting data, we see that over that same period of time, it's only about 12.5% increase in strength. And this kind of makes sense because the majority of people who get into powerlifting have probably been training before somewhat. You know, they've been recreationally training, just, you know, maybe not competing. And so it makes sense that they've already, you know, got quite a lot of strength gains out of their training. And anything they're getting after that is probably very specific from shifting towards training the powerlift specifically. And they're eking out those kind of smaller gains that are important for performance in that perspective. But we still see that they start to plateau over a reasonably similar period of time for those specific things.
I'd be interested here, quick, James, before you continue, to see how that sort of compares with your data set from your PhD and your thesis pack with that minimum sort of dose. Now, I think it's funny. I hope our listeners don't misinterpret this to mean that the regular average Joe off the street is getting way stronger than your average power lifter, right? It's because of the starting position, right? If you've never done any strength training before, odds are you're going to see significantly larger strength improvements. And Fit 20, it seems, tends to attract people who probably don't, now I'm generalizing vastly here, but probably don't really like exercise, right? That's why they're only working out once a week for 20 minutes. So their baseline is going to be significantly lower than somebody like PAK, who's a powerlifting enthusiast, or somebody like James, who's been doing strength training for a long time. PAK, I'd love you, before we continue there, to jump in, and how did that sort of compare with what you've seen in some of the powerlifting literature?
So just a quick summary for everybody who's listening in terms of the gains that the participants in the Fit 20 paper saw. So after 1 year, they were around 30 to 50% over baseline. And then after 6 years, they ended up being around 50 to 60% over baseline. So around, anywhere from 10 to 20% over those 6 years from their initial gains. Now, in my own studies, when we looked at powerlifters training with a minimum dose approach over 6 weeks, the way we analyze the data, and obviously we have to treat the outcomes of those studies with caution because we're talking about small sample sizes. We're talking about a few different co-founders that may have impacted their strength change. The way we analyze the data is we spoke with powerlifting coaches and athletes and asked them, hey, what would you regard as a meaningful strength change over 6 weeks? And then use that to calculate the probability of those interventions resulting in meaningful changes based on the input of the athletes and coaches. Allow me to note that we also compared what the coaches and athletes said was meaningful with strength changes again observed in the open powerlifting data required that allowed one to go up a place in rankings in competition, just to sort of do a safety check and make sure that we didn't just interview and question some random coaches and athletes who had unrealistic expectations, on either side of the spectrum, either positive or negative in terms of strength change. And the changes that we saw in 6 weeks, for some of the groups, they had like almost 100% probability of being meaningful. That was for the group that was doing, let's say, anywhere from 3 to 9 sets per power lift, so per exercise per week. And those were relatively heavy sets, close to failure. But allow me to note that the way the powerlifters were training was mostly through performing heavy single repetitions. So they were essentially practicing the test that they were tested in afterwards. Whereas in the Fit 20 paper, the way strength change was assessed was based on how their strength was progressing in those individual sets for each exercise, rather than saying, hey, every year we will test your 1RM strength on one of those machines. And it's important to note that the fact that the powerlifters practiced the test very intensely for 6 weeks and were also required to not have done that type of training before, may have allowed them to sort of peak their strength and express express more strength that they could pre-test versus post-test, if that makes sense. So it would be interesting to see longer term, so over, let's say, 12 to 16 weeks, whether such an approach, while testing those powerlifters midway, at the beginning, midway, and then at the end, whether that midpoint and the end point would differ that much. And my hunch is that the changes from the beginning to the middle, similarly to what we saw with the Fit 20 data, would be meaningful, but then it would start to sort of plateau and potentially even decrease based on some other data we have over time.
Yeah, thanks for sharing all that and kind of diving into the little nuances between those two. I guess my next question then is, if we're going to see this sort of plateauing effect, what it seems like is pretty hard to avoid altogether. Now, it seems like maybe you can bend that a little bit by practicing, like you said, PAK, the actual skill of whatever the test might be to show that continued improvement. But just assuming that all we're worried about is just continual strength gains, big picture strength gains over the long term. What is this a good thing or a bad thing that we're sort of seeing this plateauing effect? I guess I'm sort of leading here, and we can't improve strength gains forever, right? So is it a good thing, essentially, that we're seeing this plateau, and can we maintain it? And either of you can jump in for that.
Can I take the lead, Dr. Steele? So I think it's important to conceptualize what improvement means in certain cases, and also relate that to to a specific population. Because I would argue that if you're not gaining body weight or doing much more, and you're maintaining your strength over time, doing so little training without making any drastic changes to, again, your body weight or your training, I think that maintaining it as you're getting older and as time is passing without increasing the dose could be considered by some as still improving. And even the people in the Fit 20 data, they plateaued, but there were still slight improvements if we look at the whole data set. But for somebody who wants to continue seeing the numbers go up, if they want to see that from the strength enthusiast perspective, and they want to see more gains on certain exercises, it may be that after a certain point you may need to add a bit more training volume, nothing too crazy, and potentially look at gaining a bit of body weight. Again, nothing too crazy. A few pounds over a year may really help with sort of breaking through that plateau. But that's also with a small asterisk and a question mark. In terms of general health and staying strong, just maintaining those initial gains and keeping the habit of strength training, even if you don't see insane or extremely statistically significant strength changes, I'd say that even small changes can be meaningful, and that will depend on the person and their goals. Obviously, I'm making the assumption that we're not talking about strength athletes or competitive strength athletes.
No, that was super helpful, PAK, and exactly what I was sort of looking for, trying to dance around the question there. Essentially, what I wanted to get at, and I'd love for you to jump in on this, Dr. Steele, is one of the things we've seen is the importance of strength training as people age, right? We know that after the age of 50, sarcopenia, age-related muscle loss, and potentially dynapenia, age-related strength loss, become really rampant within the elderly populations all over the world, not just in the US and the UK, but all over. And after the age of 50, people are losing anywhere from 0.5 to 1.5% of their muscle mass per year. So 5 to 15% per decade. And maybe that's changed since the last time I saw the data, but that's the number that I've been working with. Say it's 1% they're losing after the age of 50. Well, if they can maintain that, that all of a sudden becomes a win, right? We don't need to worry about improving strength forever necessarily. But why don't you talk to us a little bit about this idea of sort of bending the age curve, Dr. Steele, if you want to jump in there, if there's anything to add.
Yeah, well, I mean, you pretty much covered it all there, Logan. I mean, that's exactly what we found. We looked at a couple of different interaction moderations in the data set, and one of those being age. So we were interested in whether or not age of participants at baseline introduction to training actually impacted the rate of growth that they had in terms of strength gains. And there really was no real effect in terms of the magnitude of gains that were produced by participants based on their starting age. So we were still seeing similar, on an absolute basis, increases in strength from 30-year-olds, 50-year-olds, and 70-year-olds. And the only difference being that, most people who start training at 70 are typically weaker than those who start at 50 and 30. But you're absolutely right. If over that 6-year period, participants would have been expected to lose roughly 6% of their strength, and yet they were increasing their strength by, 50 to 60%. So they're actively gaining during that maintenance period. You could look at it essentially, if you consider the difference between what they would be at and what they actually are at, that's an improvement in and of itself. And we've got to remember as well, the vast majority of people do not need to be training specifically to continually improve in the very specific performance associated with lifts in, specific exercises such as in powerlifting. They need to build a general we think of strength as being this underlying latent ability that people have to enable them to better perform their activities of daily living. And we improve that kind of underlying latent ability through resistance training, including a selection of exercises. Yes, we improve on those specific exercises, but really it's that general kind of strength adaptation that we're interested in, because that's what transfers to people's daily lives, reduces their risk of falls, improves their ability to, get up out of the chair, to pick up the suitcase at the airport and carry it to, baggage handling and whatnot. And, it's all of those things that are really important, particularly as we age and that people struggle with.
Yeah, and I think one of the... Oh, go ahead, PAK.
Sorry, this is going to be audio only, right?
Yes.
So because people cannot see me now, I was headbanging in the tune of Dr. Steele, because I couldn't agree more with those points. It's really cool to geek out about strength increases and specific lifts and how you can get super jacked and super strong, but at the same time those being able to maintain strength over time when it's exactly what James said. I'm not going to repeat it, but that was spot on.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that, I would even like to see, and that I kind of want to drive home, anybody in our field, one of our colleagues that's using high-end equipment, I think one of the weaknesses potentially of this Fit 20 study is that the Nautilus machines they were using have 5-pound increments, if I'm not mistaken, on the Nautilus One. Whereas using tools like MedX allows even smaller micro loading, that we could see potentially improvements over the long term in just tiny areas, right? So could potentially be something limiting there if anybody's ever trained on any sort of Nautilus equipment where a 5-pound increase, go ahead, PAK, becomes pretty significant.
Just because I raised my finger, it wasn't like yeah, stop now. But I just wanted to mention one thing that I think we haven't mentioned is the importance of being close to failure and intensity of effort within the context of minimum dose training. And for the Fit 20 paper in particular, all those sets were taken to momentary failure, and just manipulating that single variable, so making sure instead of effort is high, even if you don't have access to the fanciest equipment or to a trainer or even to equipment itself. Just doing a few exercises per week at a very, very high intensity of effort, most or ideally to momentary failure, you can reap a lot of the rewards that strength training and resistance training has to offer.
Yeah, what a wonderful point there too. And that wasn't really trying to dig into the weaknesses or anything there. Just in general, when we're looking at long-term strength adaptations and improvements, sometimes having those little micro loads could allow obviously for better tracking at least of true strength improvements over time. I'd love to, Dr. Steele, just get some of your thoughts on maybe some weaknesses of this study, areas for improvement. I know you've got a big data set that you'll continue to draw from on here. One of the things that a colleague, Tim Detman from Keyser in Australia, actually brought up to me that I hadn't thought about was the starting strength percentages, right? So the relative starting strength for these people who are coming in for the first time at Fit 20 had probably never done any sort of strength training before, and they're just getting these arbitrary starting weights, right? So could that potentially be a variable that was sort of overlooked? Maybe they could have started with a higher weight if they'd been given the opportunity, as in a lot of PAK's studies, to practice that skill of strength training first. Any thoughts on that, or other maybe weaknesses, areas for improvement going forward?
Yeah, I mean the guys at Fit 20 are pretty I was going to say anal then, but they're pretty meticulous about the protocols that they employ, and they've got pretty standardized procedures for they essentially use a kind of repetition maximum or use repetition maximum generically there, but they essentially, within the first few sessions try and determine what load is going to actually allow the participant or the clients to reach failure within the desired repetition range that they use and time under load. So, yeah, I mean, while it could be potentially an issue, the benefit is actually, even if we're slightly underestimating systematically maybe in that first session, the statistical models that we're using anyway kind of allow that to kind of blend it, blend out of the data, the overall findings, so to speak. I think one of the biggest limitations, though, is and I'll come back to a point I was going to make on the previous conversation as well, is that we don't have any data on, and partly because Fit 20 do not vary the protocol. The protocol is standardized, and this is one of the, like you said earlier, it's the beauty of it for us. It has incredibly high. It's interesting because we say it's a very ecologically and externally valid study because it's being done in real people using real facilities and things like that. But it also has a high degree of what we call internal validity because of that degree of control that they employ in their standardized protocols. But it does mean that we have to think outside the box to try and increase the generalizability or test whether the findings were generalizable. So hence looking at the powerlifting data set, the R weight room data set. I didn't mention as well, but we've also got a data set which I've done some initial analysis in a previous UK Active report from eGym participants, so users of eGym equipment, just over 500,000 participants worth of data in that specific analysis, which again showed similar things. But one of the limitations is we don't necessarily know over time how changes in the way people are training at a given point in time are impacting subsequent strength adaptations. And so one of the next steps, I think, is, like I said, we've got the eGym data, we've got a couple of other possible data sets to begin exploring, is to begin exploring how, in almost like a time-lagged fashion, because it's not like the way you're training right now impacts your strength gains right now. It could impact your strength gains, over time, in this kind of like interesting time-lagged fashion. Not to get into the details, but it's an interesting statistical problem to try and model that process over time and how things are responding. But looking at data sets where people have the possibility to vary their training, vary their loads, vary their set volumes, vary their frequencies, vary their movement velocities and repetition durations and so on. and also that data is captured on a workout by workout basis could represent a really interesting opportunity to model what impact do these variables really have over time, and do they just shift the magnitude slightly? So one of the things we've talked about before is, you look at a lot of these short-term studies and they'll say, such and such, whatever, X number of sets is better than Y number of sets over that 12-week period. And what that may imply is that actually the rate of adaptation is quicker in one versus the other, but eventually both may still hit the same plateau. You just get there earlier with one versus the other. There's a lot of these questions we don't have answers to. And I think that's one of the biggest strengths and limitations of it, is not having that data. But I guess kind of the point I wanted to make was, I think that we kind of just as humans want to improve ad infinitum, and yet we know we can't improve to infinity. There's always going to be like ceilings to what we're able to achieve. And I think one of the kind of, geeks like us are always going to want to try and push the envelope and try and figure out, those secret super source ways that are going to get us those, little bit of gains here and there and this, that, and the other. But in some ways as well, the generalizability of this kind of the way in which strength increases rapidly and then still can continue increasing, but slows down and starts to plateau out over time. There's a kind of, peace in that, in knowing that, it almost doesn't matter too much what I do. I'm still going to get there at some point. The time frame may vary, the journey may look slightly different, but at some point I'm going to kind of get roughly to, the goal. I'm going to get roughly to where my kind of limits are. And there's a kind of, it's refreshing kind of to think that way, to not stress out too much about it and know that as long as I'm doing something, doing it fairly regularly, doing it fairly hard, I can do a little bit more at some point. I can change my training slightly. Maybe I want to do a bit of powerlifting. Maybe I want to do a bit of this, but you're still going to get there if you're doing something.
Yeah, I think that was one of my biggest takeaways, and I'll let you go here in just a second, PAK, as well. But that, not that this is the optimal way to train, right? But it is a way to train, and it is a way to get results, especially in the long term. And to me, the more I've looked at the research over the last few years that I've been in the industry, the more I've started to understand that like you said, Dr. Steele, there's 1,000 different ways to skin a cat, if you will, right? We can get there as long as we're doing it consistently, as long as we're working with a high level of effort. But I think there's a freedom too for people who feel intimidated that they have to do things a certain way. They have to do what they see on Instagram, or they have to do what they see, PAK on his Instagram deadlifting 10,000 pounds, right? You don't have to do that to get results. You can do something as simple as 20 minutes once a week, 4 to 6 exercises with a high level of intensity, and you'll get there. You'll get to the promised land. It's just you're on a horse and buggy, and it's going to take you a little bit longer. And PAK and James over here are driving Ferraris to Rome, right? So that was a lot of different visuals all at once. But PAK, what would you have to add there?
I wanted to add that one must take into consideration their personal enjoyment. So whether they enjoy being in the gym more, their time availability, as well as what their goal is. So if you don't really care for lifting weights, which I understand, many people don't. For me, it's exciting. For other people, it's just, hey, I'm moving an object from place A be. So if lifting weights is not your biggest hobby and biggest passion, you don't have a ton of time available because you're busy, you're running a business, you have a family, you have other things to attend to, and maybe other types of exercise that you like to do, walking, hiking, cycling, swimming, whatever, and at the same time you want to be stronger, build some muscle, all in the context of being healthier and stronger for everyday life, and not necessarily to be the strongest individual in a certain gym just for the sake of being that individual. Doing something along the lines of what we talked about can be a really, really solid way to approach attending to this goal. And the other minor thing I wanted to mention is shifting from one program to another, or slightly changing exercises, or maybe slightly changing different variables, and let's say you're for like 3 months, you're doing the chest press and you're doing 6 to 8 reps. And then the next month you're doing push-ups and you're trying to beat and as many reps as possible, sort of an arbitrary goal that you set for yourself. Veto for things like the pull-ups. And then you're going back and forth between different exercises, rep ranges, and goals. Although that may not make a huge difference in terms of the gains that you're going to get over time, the fact that you're finding different ways to quantify the progress, and you're saying, okay, now I'm going to set a different goal. It can give you the illusion that you're constantly making progress. You're doing something different, and that goes for people like myself, switching training styles and doing a different exercise. Even though my back muscles, in terms of strength and size, may be similar to what they were a few months ago, the fact that I'm chasing a PR in a different rep range and a different exercise just gives me that illusion that, hey, tons of progress this year. My strength has changed so much. And that was a really good point by James on the fact that, yeah, the Fit20 data, great, and some level of ecological validity, but at the same time, it was the same sort of exercise over a long period of time, which I think most people may not necessarily benefit from doing. Some will. There are some people that love doing the same thing day in, day out. But for others who want to feel like they're making more progress and they're seeing numbers change, you can vary the exercises, rep ranges, and set different goals, and that can make training so much more interesting.
Yeah, I love that, PAK. So many great points there. And I'm sensitive to both of your time, so I want to sort of wrap this up here. I'd love to hear if either of you have some closing thoughts. But to me, the biggest takeaways, besides everything you just mentioned there, PAK, with that freedom of variety and continuing to chase gains, we'll call it, even though they may not actually be new gains, is, we get strong really fast, especially if we've never strength trained before. Now, we may plateau, but it doesn't have to be a plateau, right? We can continue to create the illusion of progress by mixing things up. But even if it is a plateau, even if we've reached that sort of mountaintop of what our gains might be, after the age of 40 or 50, maintaining is actually gaining, right? Where everybody else is going in the opposite direction. If you can hold on to what you have, that's a huge win. And it doesn't take a lot to do it, right? A little tiny bit just to get those gains, get the amount of strength that you need to live a better life overall, and then do all the other stuff that you want to do, whatever that might be. For PAK, for James, it might be more strength training. For me, it's going to be more strength training. But for Dr. Fisher, it may be cycling. For Luke Carlson, it might be running marathons, whatever those other things are that we enjoy doing outside, but just get that minimum dose at the very least to see those benefits in the long term. Anything else you guys would like to add before I let you go today?
Just wanted to agree with that and say that, yeah, building that habit is key. Build that habit and you are going to be so much better off than not strength training as you're aging. So find a way to build that habit, whether that be minimum dose or minimum dose plus a couple of sets, and just make it a part of your daily routine. Even if it's not in a gym, even if it's just at home doing pull-ups, push-ups, and single leg squats, it will be a game changer for your life over time. And just let it run its course, the same as an investment. Plant that seed, let it grow, let it do its thing.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more. Hey, I'm the bodyweight guy, so everything's super simple for me. Simple training, more time for golf, and that's it. I was going to say as well, I feel like after PAK took up extra time at the beginning, I suddenly remembered a big project that I am working on, which I'll give a quick teaser from, because it links into what I was talking earlier about this. What relatively speaking, we do really know about the manipulation of different variables over time. And we're working on a essentially, let's call it the meta-analysis of everything. We're working on a big living meta-analysis project. It's pretty much going to include every study ever conducted on resistance training, looking at kind of dose response relationships, and it's going to be some really cool stuff. It's going to take some time to put together and build and work, but it's going to be openly available, interactive, and people can jump in there and see, if I manipulate this that way, if I tweak that way, what does that look like? What does the totality of data tell me from the scientific literature about the impact that these things have on strength, on hypertrophy, on power, on clinical outcomes, so on and so forth.
Yeah, super interesting, guys. And we're so thankful in the exercise industry in general to have great minds like the two of you and the rest of the team at Solent University working on these problems in unison together to help everyone find these outcomes that they're looking for. I'm so thankful to have you both on. So thankful to have a paper like this that really starts to point us in the right direction and just keep doing the stuff you're doing. I'm so excited to see what the outcomes are going to be in the next few years, and it's an exciting time for the resistance training community. Things are really starting to point in our direction. Did you have any closing thoughts there, PAK, as well?
I was just pointing at James when you said thankful for you guys. I was just giving.
There you go.
James.
Well, thank you guys both for joining me. Yeah, of course. And for anybody interested in reading the Fit 20 paper, we'll have a link to it in our website on the description. I would definitely encourage you to check it out, even though some of the data is a little convoluted because James is king data over there. It's definitely worth looking into and seeing some of the visuals, some of the graphs that are in that paper are super interesting. And I think definitely worth checking out. Guys, thank you so much for your time today. Thanks everyone for listening. And we look forward to having more great researchers on in the near future.